Hello, everybody. Welcome. Here we're talking about ecology in a very brief and very general overview for natural science students. In part one, we're going to talk about metabolism and cycles of materials. And in part two, we're going to talk about the food chains and food webs. Okay? So first, we want to talk about food. Food is energy, okay? So let's talk about macronutrients. Now, recall, cells are essentially a well-organized assembly of macromolecules in water. And recall that macromolecules are produced by the polymerization of smaller units called monomers, okay? For cells to build all of these complex molecules required to sustain life, they need certain substances called nutrients. Now, when prokaryotes grow in nature, they must obtain their nutrients from the environment. Nutrients that are required in large amounts are called macronutrients, okay? Whereas those required in smaller or trace amounts are called micronutrients. Now, just a handful of elements are considered macronutrients: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So a useful way to remember this is that mnemonic chomps, okay? Chomps. Kind of like chomps, but instead of an M, it's an N. So again, that's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Okay, so why are these macronutrients needed in large amounts? Well, they are the components of organic compounds in cells, including water. So carbon is the major element in all macromolecules. Carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, lipids, and many other compounds. So carbon accounts for about 50% of the composition of the cell. In contrast, nitrogen represents only about 12% of the total dry weight of a typical cell. Nitrogen is a critical component of proteins, nucleic acids, and other cell constituents. Most of the nitrogen available in nature is either atmospheric nitrogen in the form of N2 or another inorganic form found in like rocks or something, okay? So diatomic nitrogen, or N2, can be converted into an organic form only by certain microorganisms called nitrogen-fixing organisms. Both hydrogen and oxygen are part of many organic compounds and, of course, components of water. Now, phosphorus is required by all organisms for the synthesis of nucleotides and phospholipids. Sulfur is part of the structure of some amino acids, such as cysteine and methionine, and it's also present in several vitamins and coenzymes. Vitamin comes from its name, vital mineral, but these are organic compounds, so some of them contain sulfur. Other important macronutrients are potassium, magnesium, calcium, and sodium. Although these elements are required in smaller amounts, they are very important for the structure and function of the prokaryotic cell. So that's why they're called macronutrients. What about micronutrients? In addition to these macronutrients, prokaryotes require various metallic elements in very small amounts. These are referred to as micronutrients or trace elements. For example, iron is necessary for the function of the cytochromes involved in electron transport reactions. Some prokaryotes require other elements such as boron, chromium, and manganese, primarily as enzyme cofactors. So I've highlighted them here in green on the periodic table so you can see the handful of elements that are required for life. So you can see how many of these are just grayed out. So you don't need neodymium, you don't need cesium, okay? You don't need argon. So these are the micronutrients or trace elements required. Now let's talk about how organisms obtain energy, where they get it, how they make it, or what is energy in terms of ecology or a food chain or a food web. So prokaryotes are classified both by the way they obtain energy and by the carbon source they use for producing organic molecules. Now these categories are summarized in the textbook. Prokaryotes, and I've got these two main categories here in bullet points, okay, that we want to focus on here. Prokaryotes can use different sources of energy to generate the ATP needed for biosynthesis and other cellular activities. Phototrophs, okay, phototrophs or phototrophic organisms obtain their energy from the sunlight. Phototrophs trap the energy of light using chlorophylls or, in a few cases, bacterial rhodopsin. Rhodopsin is kind of like an oddball. It's a phototrophic organism, but it's not photosynthesis because technically it does not fix carbon, okay? But for my class, natural science here, when you think phototroph, think plant, okay, which is green, or think about a cyanobacteria, which is a blue-green algae, which does photosynthesis, okay? So typically they're green color because of the chlorophylls. They absorb sunlight and they convert that into different energy-storing molecules. Now, chemotrophs, okay, keyword chemotrophs. Chemotrophs or chemosynthetic organisms obtain their energy from chemical compounds. Okay, we'll see more pictures and details of this in a bit. Chemotrophs that can use organic compounds as energy sources are called chemoorganotrophs. Now, those that use inorganic compounds like sulfur or ion compounds as energy sources are called chemolithotrophs. Here in my natural science course, I don't distinguish between those subtypes. I just distinguish between the main types of guys, okay? So chemotrophs obtain energy by chemicals or food. That would be you. To recharge your energy in the day, you eat a big healthy breakfast and you get the energy for the rest of the day. For a plant, they need to be placed in sunlight or artificial sunlight to perform photosynthesis and get the energy they needed to, say, for example, survive the night when there's no sunlight shining. Now let's talk about different material cycles. The carbon cycle is very important, okay? Now, participants in the carbon cycle are roughly divided among producers, consumers, and decomposers of organic carbon compounds. The primary producers of organic carbon compounds from CO2 or carbon dioxide are land plants and photosynthetic bacteria. Now, a large amount of available carbon is found in living land plants, okay? A related source of carbon compounds is humus, which is a mixture of organic materials from dead plants and prokaryotes that have resisted decomposition. You could think about this as a sludge, or when leaves don't quite break down and they form like this slimy thing. That's basically humus, okay? Now, consumers such as animals and other heterotrophs use organic compounds generated by producers and release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Let me clarify. Your cat, for example, might eat some kind of cat food that's made from fish or other kinds of plants or something in there, okay, that's mixed up and produced for a healthy cat. And in the process of consuming that food, they produce and release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, okay? Now, other bacteria and fungi, collectively called decomposers, carry out the breakdown, which we call decomposition of plants and animals and their organic compounds. Most carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is derived from the respiration of microorganisms that decompose dead animals, plants, and humus, okay? So, it's not you or me producing carbon dioxide by breathing that produces most of the carbon dioxide from biological organisms. It's actually bacteria, okay? So when all those leaves fall in the backyard of your house, there's different fungus, bacteria that are growing on that leaf to help decompose it. And remember again that it's composed of carbon. There's a lot of carbon in plants. We know this because you can burn a tree, you can see the very black soot that's produced, the charcoal, right, before the wood, say, completely burns away. But think about what happens to a dead tree in a forest, okay? There's termites that go in there that help decompose and break down that tree. There's interesting fungus or mushroom-looking things that grow on a rotten stump to help break that down and digest that. There's other kinds of molds, fungi, and bacteria that you cannot see except with a microscope that help break down that wood. All the while this is happening, each of those tiny microorganisms is producing carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide that used to be trapped in that tree is now slowly, over the course of years, being released to the environment. Okay? So there's a little figure here. It might be too small to see, but decomposers play a critical and a major part in releasing carbon dioxide. And plants and photosynthetic bacteria play a critical role in fixing carbon or bringing carbon dioxide or carbon out of the air, okay, to make a bigger tree or make an algae somewhere in a pond. Nitrogen is a very important element for life because, as I mentioned, it is a major constituent of the amino acids which are used to build up proteins. So you could think about muscles, but even bacteria need amino acids for all of their different enzymes and cell functions, okay? Nitrogen is also a critical component of nucleic acids. Remember, we call that DNA, mainly speaking, okay? The genetic code that is in the cell is made of nitrogen. So you need nitrogen for life to occur. Now, nitrogen is a macronutrient. And in nature, it is recycled from organic compounds to ammonia, ammonium ions, nitrate, nitrite, and nitrogen gas by many processes, many of which are carried out only by prokaryotes. Okay, you can see this little figure here, I hope, on the video. As you can see in this figure, prokaryotes are key to the nitrogen cycle. The largest pool of nitrogen available in the terrestrial ecosystem is gaseous nitrogen from the air. N2 in the air, right as I'm speaking here in the lab, comprises 80% of the atmospheric gases, okay? Nitrogen is 80%, air is 80% nitrogen. So there's a lot of nitrogen there, but this nitrogen is not usable by plants. They can't breathe it in. And plants, remember, are primary producers. Gaseous nitrogen must first be transformed or fixed into more readily available forms such as ammonia through the process of nitrogen fixation. Now it's really cool because there are nitrogen fixing bacteria including Azotobacter in soil and the ubiquitous photosynthetic cyanobacteria. Some nitrogen fixing bacteria like Rhizobium live in symbiotic relationships in the roots of legumes. Now, we've talked about this, how the bean plants have bacteria on them. They're able to use nitrogen from the air to basically fertilize the soybean plants, okay? Another source of ammonia is ammonification, the process by which ammonia is released during the decomposition of nitrogen-containing organic compounds. I know it's not pleasant to talk about, but we'll talk about a baby's wet diaper. If an old diaper is allowed to sit around for a while, it smells like ammonia. It begins to stink. And the reason for that is that there are different bacteria that decompose urea, which is the chemical excreted by humans to produce ammonia, which is a gas which has that stinky odor, okay? But this is a critical part of these certain bacteria's ability to release nitrogen in the form of ammonia, which then can be used by plants, okay? Now, the ammonium ion is progressively oxidized by different species of bacteria in a process called nitrification. The nitrification process begins with the conversion of ammonium to nitrite, and continues with the conversion of nitrite to nitrate, okay? And these are just different chemicals, okay? And nitrification in soils is carried out by bacteria belonging to the various types, the nitrosomos, nitrobacter, and nitrospira. Most nitrogen in the soil is in the form of ammonium or nitrate, and ammonia and nitrate can be used by plants or converted to other forms. And this is the very reason we use ammonium nitrate to fertilize our our flower bed, our grass, things like that that we want to grow well. Ammonium nitrate is a very important fertilizer that's man-made in sufficient quantities to fertilize fields of corn and whatnot, okay? In nature, out in just the wilderness, far away from any farm where grass is growing, there are different bacteria within the soil that do all of this to bring nitrogen from the air to convert that to ammonium and nitrate to fertilize the grass, okay, in a natural process. Life in an ecosystem is often about competition for limited resources. Now, this is a characteristic of the theory of natural selection. Now, competition in communities, remember, which is defined as all the living things within specific habitats, is observed both within species and among different species. The resources for which organisms compete include organic material, sunlight, and mineral nutrients, which provide the energy for living processes and the matter to make up organisms' physical structures, okay? Other critical factors influencing community dynamics are the components of its physical and geographic environment, a habitat's latitude, the amount of rainfall, the topography, maybe the elevation, and available species. Now, these are all important environmental variables that determine which organisms can exist within a particular area. If I think about my garden, I see that weeds grow more in the spring, you know, when the environment starts warming up, when we get a little bit of rainfall. And then I noticed that there are different weeds growing in different shaded regions by my house because perhaps they don't tolerate direct sunlight as well. So you can just look around your house or just look around nature and you can kind of begin to think about these things. Oh, why is there moss only growing on certain sides of the tree? Well, because that's the shaded side of the tree, and presumably it's more tolerant to that environment. Now, an ecosystem, as I mentioned, is a community of living organisms and their interactions with their abiotic or non-living environments. So ecosystems can be small, such as the tide pools found near the rocky shores of many oceans, or large, such as the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. Now, there are three broad categories of ecosystems based on their general environment. We've got freshwater, ocean water, and terrestrial. That means land. Within these three broad categories are individual ecosystem types based on the organisms present and the type of environmental habitat. Here on this slide, I just want to emphasize that an ecosystem is the living stuff and the non-living stuff within that boundary, okay? So, for example, the tree and the river and the rocks could all be part of a forest ecosystem. Now let's talk about ocean ecosystems. Ocean ecosystems are the most common, of course, because over 70% of the Earth's surface is made of the ocean, and it consists of three basic types, okay? Shallow ocean, deep ocean, water, and deep ocean surfaces, the low depth areas of the deep oceans. And I have a figure here so you can kind of look at, you know, the different zones and whatnot. The shallow ocean ecosystems include extremely biodiverse coral reef ecosystems, and the deep ocean surface is known for its large numbers of plankton and krill, which are small crustaceans that support it. These two environments are especially important to aerobic respirators worldwide, as the phytoplankton performs 40% of all photosynthesis on Earth. Now, we've talked about this. The phytoplankton are photosynthetic organisms that can that receive sunlight, okay, and that's only possible on the top part of the ocean, because if you're deeper than, I think, whatever it is, 250 feet or so, the water absorbs sunlight, and so if you're deep down in the ocean, you don't have the ability for plankton to perform photosynthesis, which needs sunlight, okay? You need light. So only the top part, the photic zone, it's mentioned here, 0 to 200 feet, is where all of 40% of the world's oxygen is made. So that's just amazing to me. And fortunately, the Earth is covered with oceans, so a lot of that occurs near land, but for the most part, all the ocean is available for this. Now, although not as diverse as the other two, deep ocean ecosystems contain a wide variety of marine organisms, and such ecosystems exist even at the very bottom of the ocean where light is unable to penetrate through the water. Now, freshwater ecosystems are the rarest because you might not know this, but only 1.8% of the Earth's surface is comprised of fresh water. Lakes, rivers, streams, and springs comprise these systems. They are quite diverse, and they support a variety of fish, amphibian, reptiles, insects, phytoplankton, fungi, and bacteria, and even waterfowl. I don't like this figure because it doesn't show maybe a duck or something, but you've got all different kinds of things. You've got this herbivorous insect here that's going to only eat plants. You've got a carnivorous animal such as what's it called? A crawfish or a crawdad, and that's going to eat little worms or other kind of insects. You've got fish, and then in the circles on this figure here on the slide, you have organisms that are too small to see with just your eye. You need to have a microscope. But you've got various fungi and bacteria and protozoa and so on and so forth, okay? Including phytoplankton, okay? Phytoplankton is also in freshwater environments, okay? It's not just salt water. Now, terrestrial ecosystems are also known for their diversity, and they're grouped into large categories called biomes, such as tropical rainforest, savannas, deserts, coniferous forests, deciduous forests, and tundra. Grouping these ecosystems into just a few biome categories obscures the great diversity of the individual ecosystems within them. For example, there is great variation in desert vegetation. The saguaro cacti and other plants living in the Sonoran Desert in the United States, shown here in the figure on the left, are relatively abundant compared to the desolate rocky desert of Boa Vista. It's an island off the coast of Western Africa, and you've got a picture of some of the desert there. It just looks like the surface of Mars, a bunch of rocks and sand. So just because we say something is a desert biome doesn't really tell you much about it. That, in a nutshell, gives you an idea of different biomes, what an ecosystem is. It's part of plants, animals, bacteria, rocks, rivers, the hills and the mountains that make up that area. And we've talked a little bit about the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and how things get their energy. So I hope this video was helpful in a very basic general sense for natural science students. Please consider liking, subscribing, give a thumbs up for me, and have a great day, everybody.